Hello, welcome everybody to this Oxford Interfaith Forum, International Interfaith Reading Group on Eschatology in Interfaith Contexts. And this morning, we are truly grateful that each one of you had made the time to come here. And I know that we are going to have a wonderful time engaging and also to be able to hear from our distinguished guests. And at this time, I would also like to say that at the time of Q&A, either you raise your hand or you can click on that raise hand emoji or type in your questions into the chat box. And without much delay, I would like to hand this over to Dr. Goldingay, who will be introducing our distinguished guests. And Dr. Goldingay doesn't need any introduction, but he is our professor. He was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and we have read so much of his writings, and we are truly grateful to you, Dr. Goldingay, for coming and leading the session and also introducing our distinguished guest. And over to Dr. Goldingay.
Thank you, Carolyn. Well, I'm not supposed to be doing this at all, but the chair has kind of got lost somehow. And so I've been deputed to do the introduction, which I'm not really going to do. But first of all, I'm going to say how wonderful is Thea, who organizes this entire enterprise and copes with whatever crises happen, like the fact that this evening, well, it's for me, I don't know where you are, Caroline, but for me, it's evening, which is why I just confessed I was drinking a glass of sherry. So here we are about to start, and Thea has discovered that the chair was missing, so she turned to me because I'm just around the corner in Oxford. But all I'm going to do actually is hand over to Ben and Sandy, who have got ways of introducing each other. So I'm going to thank them very much for being here tonight, this afternoon, and hand over to them. Thank you.
So I'm going to get to say a quick welcome, and we are missing the presence of the Archbishop, but I'm here at Georgetown University, channeling the spirit of great Catholic leadership and wisdom and ideas, and so he is very much felt in spirit. I'm Rabbi Joshua Stanton. I am the rabbi at East End Temple in Manhattan, and I'm a senior fellow at CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. And my dear friend, my study partner, and my fellow author is Rabbi Benjamin Spratt. And Benjamin Spratt is senior rabbi at Congregation Rodeph Sholom, one of the flagship synagogues in the United States. It is based all of 2 miles away from mine on the island of Manhattan. And so we get to do a lot of work together. Ben is widely respected and esteemed among his colleagues and friends. And we have a forthcoming book entitled Awakenings, which is coming out. And in the course of it, we found ourselves drawn and enmeshed in eschatology related to one rabbi in particular, Rabbi Akiva. And so we're going to do a deep dive on his texts, his wisdom, his ideas around belief, belonging, and identity. And given the time he was living through, apologize for some background noise, the benefit of Georgetown and the challenges, he was living through a time of radical change, upheaval, and pain. And many of his contemporaries, and probably Rabbi Akiva himself, thought that it was really possible that the world was coming to an end, human life was coming to an end, Judaism was coming to an end. And so eschatology was not just something of theoretical consideration or spiritual inquiry, it was a profound and immediate human need. And he found 3 main approaches for dealing with the eschaton, which he thought was about ready to happen. It was belief, belonging, and identity. And what he did, and we're going to read 3 different texts focusing on one in particular, is along those axes of belief, belonging, and identity, he found that his best response was humility, hope, and the search for a higher purpose. And why humility, hope, and the search for a higher purpose? Because those are within the realm of human capacity, even when events that are so great, so much bigger than any of us, are front of mind and at the center of world events. So Ben, I turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh, and what an honor to be with you all. So we're going to explore a handful of texts here. I've shared my screen. This is just meant to make it a little easier for those of you wanting to follow along. As a bit of context, as Josh indicated, we're going to be exploring some of the teachings of Rabbi Akiva. What makes him remarkable in many ways is that he's a person who's the progeny not of hierarchy or social status. He actually was likely from a family of, his father likely was a person who converted to Judaism. And at that point, there was a lot of social stigma around that notion of choosing Judaism as opposed to be born into it. And he was illiterate. Legend has it up until the age of 40, and started to learn actually at the age of 40 and then became one of the greatest of rabbis. And for a number of reasons, as we'll explore later, we actually think his origin story is really deeply connected to these core ideas that we're going to lift up of humility, hope, and purpose. So I'm going to move forward to our first text on humility. Josh, you want to take us through that?
Absolutely, that sounds great. So this is a classic text, and it makes us recognize and affirm that we can't know everything, certainly when it comes to eschatology, but even the basics of human life are often beyond us. We can't do everything, and it may be a good thing if the world moves beyond us. So perhaps inverting the idea of the eschaton of the world ending, and maybe clarifying the idea of the eschaton, is the idea of the world not ending, but our very temporal end, and the world moving beyond us. So here we have Menachot 29b, and Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. Again, this is a thought experiment. We do not necessarily think that Moses literally was transported to that time. Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, and his students said to him, "My teacher, where do you derive this idea?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "It is a Jewish law transmitted to Moses from Sinai." When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive, or he had received, as the case may be. And so what does this suggest? On a few levels. One, if a person as great and wise as Moses can find himself totally overwhelmed, totally confused by the world and its in the fullness of the change therein, certainly we too have permission to feel it. Second, if the eschaton does not come and the world keeps going, it can even pass us by, even if our contributions are as great as that of Moses. If the world goes on and does not end, humanity will progress beyond us. And that can be scary and that can be overwhelming. But if we can embrace the humility that Moses had in a classroom for Torah learning, then we too can find comfort in seeing the seedlings all of a sudden having germinated and given birth to a remarkable tradition long after our time. So if the eschaton does not happen, to our surprise, the world continues forward and we have humility and strength to encounter it, we can meet it with wonder and see the good that has happened even in our absence. So I'm wondering if we can consider the second text. I just have to give credit to William Norland, who, in the spirit of Rabbi Akiva, is one of my Intro to Judaism students, someone who is considering becoming a Jew by choice. And so it seemed fitting to include one of his original pieces.
Beautiful. So we're going to move into hope. And for some of us right now, perhaps this is the most challenging element in our world to try to hold on to. And one of the elements that we want to explore here is the way in which change actually can be a positive element, even as it is sometimes disruptive and sometimes inspires fear. That redemption actually can emerge even from the deepest hurt. And so at times when we feel the most apocalyptic, as we look at not only the world as it is right now, but as we think about the eschaton, sometimes it is actually through the dismantling of the very structures that give us stability that we come to new creation and the promise of a new age. So as we go into this next text, just a little bit of context. So Rabbi Akiva was born about 50 CE, so a little bit before the destruction of the Second Temple. In the context of biblical Judaism, the temple had been the very centerpiece of the Jewish world. It was believed to be the house of God. It was the only place really where one could commune with the divine, and it required pilgrimage in order to do so. With the destruction of the temple, the disbanding of the priesthood, it meant that actually people felt as though they were cut off from God. And the early rabbinic project, so by the time Rabbi Akiva reaches maturity and becomes a rabbi, he's living in a post-temple form of Judaism where he and fellow sages had to completely reimagine the world in which they existed. The center of Judaism was gone, the structures of power and the way that people would connect with God were gone. And so this text is imagining that, this comes from Makot 24b, imagines that there was an occasion where a group of these sages were ascending to Jerusalem. They were traveling around the land after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus, a nearby mountain that overlooks the Temple Mount, and saw the site of the temple, they tore their garments in mourning, in keeping with Jewish law, halachic practice. When they arrived actually at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the very site of the Holy of Holies, the most holy part of the Holy Temple. And so they began weeping, all of these rabbis, except Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing? How could you laugh as we sit here at the destruction, the ruins of the heart of our people, and a fox has made its burrow, its den in the very place where God used to dwell?" And Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "This is the place concerning that which is written. And the non-priest who approaches shall die. This place that is the Holy of Holies, that only one person, the high priest, could enter on one day of the year. Now we find foxes walk in it. How could we do anything but weep?" And Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I'm laughing. As it is written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Isaiah, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Zeberechiah." So this is a reference, and this goes on for a while, to two different prophecies. One that suggested that one day the temple would be destroyed and would lay in ruins, and the other that the temple would be rebuilt and people at an elderly age would be sitting in peace and harmony in the streets of Jerusalem. And Rabbi Akiva said, since we know now that these walls had to come down, and that has been accomplished, it also means we get to turn our attention to the realization of the second prophecy, which means that a new building, a new creation will come, and that peace and harmony will return to this land. And so the story actually ends with the other rabbis turning to Akiva and saying, "Akiva, you have comforted us, you've comforted us." And what's brilliant, I think, about this story is that it names the pain of what happens when we see the world as we knew it, the very structures that gave us confidence and a sense of safety, when they are collapsed and crushed. And yet we also get to see that inevitably we saw that these things would have to come down, that whatever is the eschaton, whatever is coming next, that we know that it is going to require change and disruption. And that sometimes the very things that give us hope require suffering to get there. And part of what Akiva was helping these rabbis do is to appropriately name the feelings of loss, but also to be able to see that the story doesn't end there. Out of destruction come the very seeds of renewal. So I'll turn things back to you, Josh.
Just a couple of thoughts and a couple of additions before we go to higher purpose as a way to, I guess, create a human response if we feel as though we are living through a time period that is filled with destruction and doubt and fear in the way of the eschaton itself. And first of all, from a rabbinic perspective and from a Jewish perspective, and there are obviously many of both, one could make the argument that the destruction of the Second Temple was an eschaton unto itself. And that from the framework of Jewish eschatology, it might not be the end of days, but an end of days, the end of a particular era that is filled with destruction and death and fear and sadness and total upheaval and change, to the point that Moses could not recognize what came after it. And putting the two texts in dialogue already, we see that Akiva, who plays a part in each, he is a bridge figure from the eschaton to what comes later. So he sees the temple smoldering, and then he builds something that is so great and enduring that it is derived from the words of Moses, and yet would be perplexing to Moses himself. So an eschaton, if it is not the end of days, but an end of days, can actually lead to a period of profound awakening and change and growth of spiritual revolution, not just evolution, that ultimately lays the groundwork for something much better. And I'm going to put it very bluntly and in a way that I apologize if it is offensive to anybody, but the eschaton of the Second Temple is why I am not a priest who sacrifices animals on an altar, but am a rabbi who gets to be with all of you, learning about sacred texts and sacred words. And so I can at once profoundly mourn and feel the grief of an eschaton without wishing that we would just go back to the time period before it. And so it's a contrast, a contradiction, and something that fills me with wonder as a Jewish person in approaching this underlying topic itself. So what emerges from an eschaton and the struggle it creates and the problems it creates and the pain and suffering inherent to it, sometimes what emerges is clarity of what the higher purpose is, or maybe should have been all along. Because a purpose that endures in eschaton is certainly worthy of our human pursuits. Without purpose, change happens to us. We're passive recipients. With purpose, we can actually help shape it and what comes next. And a higher purpose is essential to our lives, worth taking risks to advance or preserve. So we're going to delve into these higher purposes and the risk-taking that Akiva engaged in, because in his mind, I would submit to you, there was one eschaton and a second eschaton. Eschaton 1 is the destruction of the temple itself. Eschaton 2 is the destruction of the temple of Torah, meaning the Romans forbade its study. Wow. That was a destruction of a different temple that was intended to withstand anything because it could reside within our very beings. And in the Romans, not only destroying the temple, but destroying that which came after it, we see a higher purpose emerge that ultimately outlasted the Roman Empire, that outlasted the one, if not two, eschatons, and that endures today as a beacon. Indeed, we are approaching an eschaton of our own making in the modern and postmodern world. It happened that the wicked Roman government issued a decree forbidding the Jews to study and practice Torah. This is from Brachot 61a. Papas ben Yehuda came and found Rabbi Akiva convening the public and teaching Torah. And Papas said to him, Akiva, are you not afraid of the government? And Akiva replied, I will explain the matter to you with a parable, a very rabbinic response. A fox was once walking alongside of a river and saw a fish going in shoals from one place to another. The fox said to them, from what are you fleeing? The fish replied, from the nets cast for us by men. The fox then said to them, would you like to come up to the dry land so that you and I can live together in the way that my ancestors lived with your ancestors? And the fish replied, are you the one that they call the cleverest of animals? Are you not clever but foolish? If we are afraid in our natural element in which we live, how much the more so would we be afraid in the element in which we would die. In essence, without the waters of Torah, surely we will pass. So here we go. So it is with us. If this is our condition, when we sit and study the Torah, of which it is written, for that is your life and the length of your days. If we go and neglect it, how much the worse off shall we be? So herein, I think Akiva clarifies the tension inherent to these three passages about him among the many that exist. And that is the tension we feel in our limited human perception between what is the end of days for everyone and what is the end of days for us as an individual or as a group. And what is so challenging from our limited human perspective is that it's easy to conflate the two of them. And if we are being forced out of the waters of Torah, it might seem as though the waters themselves are drying up. They might or might not be. And if we are coming face to face with a temple that is destroyed, we might just see ruins. But from them may yet emerge a brilliant tradition that needs no building at all. And with the pain that Moses felt in the back of Akiva's classroom until he heard himself evoked by name, he could have thought that that brilliant tradition of the mind and the heart was itself lost. And instead we see that it just progressed beyond him. So within the Jewish framework for eschatology, we see and experience firsthand the tension between our perception of an end of days and an actual end of days, between an end of a type of day and an end of all days, and the question of whether there will be an ultimate eschaton, an ultimate redemption, or whether we will simply continue in the way Mechilta talks about it, with peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys, until perhaps maybe there is an ultimate redemption. So it calls into question whether there is Jewish eschatology per se, or whether there are Jewish eschatologies, and then what it means for us as people.
And for all of us, I think some of this raises the question of what are the technologies, the tools that we can lift up to promote a sense of humility that inspires curiosity and questioning, a sense of hope in the face of a world that often inclines towards despair, and a sense of purpose when, for so many of us, our purpose is an inherited sense of nostalgia and maintenance of how things have been comfortable. And to bring in a particularly Jewish lens, the technology of our sacred text, our Torah, affords us a little bit of a help in this. As some of you know, a Torah scroll is our central text in Judaism, and it has no punctuation or any vowels. What it means is to read the text itself requires the assumption of interpretation. And our first story of Akiva, as we see Moses baffled by the teachings of Akiva, and yet to say those teachings are all woven within these words is to assume that our perception, our understanding, and our read are never complete, that there is always more to the question. And when we believe that we are perceiving the eschaton or the eschatologies, we get to see that there's a question inherent in it for us about whether this is actually just the beginning, the threshold to another glorious day. And the only way we'll know it is by creating space and question. We are often inclined, when we see the very things we love most crushed and destroyed, to assume the world is coming to an end because we feel it in the most personal of ways. And yet, it is that same humility that may inspire hope as we get to see that again and again in the patterns of our lives and those who have come before us. Often when we have thought that everything is coming to an end, there is often a transformation that allows us to see, in fact, that was simply a threshold to a new beginning. And finally, as Josh said beautifully here, so much of this technology of hope and humility requires us to acknowledge that there is a purpose to our lives and to this world. And sometimes it requires us to be unsettled by the space given by another, or the space cleared by the destruction that comes from out of our own stability, that allows us to see that what drives us in this world has to be more than mere survival or mere maintenance of what is, or simply instinctual reactions to fear. It has to be some calling that inspires us towards a brighter day. And so we're grateful that we get to be in conversation with you all, because each of us is bringing into the space our own tools, our own wisdom, our own understanding. And in the framework of Judaism, we believe that this forum is the very most important technology of how we face the eschaton and look at the opportunity that is within it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I want to say one point that is perhaps controversial even among us as co-authors. And the controversy is that certainly in the Jewish community in diaspora, it feels like we are approaching a mini eschaton. If you look at the statistics, the number of Jews in the United States keeps going up, but fewer than 15% are connected to any organization in the American diaspora. And what that feels like for many is an end of days, because our institutions are not going to be with us in the way that they currently are in another generation. And so literally people are describing the present as a second Holocaust, as a time of the dissolution of the Jewish people in diaspora. And what gives us such hope is these texts about Rabbi Akiva and the eschaton, because we know that the eschaton, as much as it is an end of days, might not be the end of all days. And so that is the essence of our writing together and our work together. But for the first time in Jewish history, two rabbis concluded their remarks slightly early, which might well leave us the possibility of some dialogue with all of you, which we would greatly enjoy.
Thank you, guys. Just a response to what you said at the very end. I don't think the position of Judaism is in the United States is so different from the position of Christian faith in the West in general, and so we have to face the same kind of issues, really. But and in a minute I'm going to ask anybody who'd like to. We're going to see if there's any questions, but I'm going to use the chair's privilege of asking a question or making a comment. What really struck me at the earlier part of what you were doing, much more forcibly, was the parallel between Akiva and the CE 70 context and that of Jeremiah and the first fall of Jerusalem. Because my job is being a professor of the Hebrew Bible as a Christian, and that's what struck me as the parallel, and particularly because, not least in Jeremiah himself, both the nature of the catastrophe of the fall of Jerusalem in 587, but then of what issued from it positively. And I'm not sure whether this is going to be heresy to you guys, but part of it then was actually the production of the Torah as we know it, which in my thinking is what Ezra brought back from to Jerusalem. That's a little bit, I mean, there are scholars argue about that, but the idea that the Torah paradoxically emerged in part from the fall of Jerusalem and the exile. Thank you for nodding, Josh. I'm feeling much better now. That seems to me to be a really interesting parallel to what you were saying about the productivity, the creativity of what could come out of that first eschaton in AD 70. Because certainly Jeremiah talked about, and Lamentations and so on, talk about the fall of Jerusalem in 587 as the day of the Lord. In other words, if you like, in our terms, as the eschaton. And it was, to adapt your phrase again, a day of the Lord, but it turned out to be not the day of the Lord. And God hadn't finished with his people, and his people hadn't finished with God either. So that the kind of thinking that they carried on doing both in diaspora in Babylon and in Judah, and for that matter in Egypt, in my way of thinking about it, was something that issued in the production of both the Torah and the prophets, so that what seemed to be an unmitigated disaster in AD 70 was much less of one than it would have seemed if you'd actually been there. And thank you for nodding, but I'd like to see if either of you got comments on the analogy between 587 and 70.
It's such a fabulous point. I'm going to let Ben respond more fully. I think what bubbles up for me is the question about whether Akiva plays a role akin to Ezra and Nehemiah, when those were conjoined books, in bringing the codified text. It's unclear that they were reading at the Watergate, the 5 books of Moses. There's some evidence, maybe Book of Kings, maybe something else, but they were bringing the technology of the scroll, the public reading, the learning in place of centralized worship came out of the diaspora experience. There is absolutely a parallel, because there's already the shift away from the central institution of the temple. You look at the days when Torah was read, it's the market days. It's Mondays, Thursdays, and then Shabbat. So it's 2 market days and Shabbat, and that's moving away from the temple. It's moving to the people. It's making study central. So absolutely, in ways that are critical, there are parallels. And what Mechilta says is that there are periods of oppression. Mechilta being a remarkable rabbinic commentary on the Exodus, there are oppressions and redemptions and oppressions and redemptions and oppressions and redemptions, and then a final redemption. And what it implies is we don't know which is actually going to be the final redemption, but there are going to be multiple redemptions as great as the Exodus and oppressions as terrible as Egypt. And we don't know when the eschaton is happening, but there will be many smaller ones that we live through and grow from each during.
But there's
by all means,
there is then an important tension between, between the worship in Jerusalem and the Babylonian, the diaspora continuing. They do go, Judahites do go back to Jerusalem and they do rebuild the temple, and the temple is really important. And yet Judaism never becomes again something that's simply focused on Canaan, on Palestine. And this, there are kind of analogy then with now that, and I don't know how to talk about or what to say about the relationship between the diaspora and Israel today, because that relationship and that kind of balance has changed monumentally over the last 10 or 20 years, hasn't it? And is going to carry on changing. And who knows what's going to happen in Israel, and who knows what's going to happen to Judaism in the United States, as you said. But not nothing, because God carries on being God, and Israel carries on being Israel. Israel in the broad sense, the Jewish people carries on being the Jewish people.
John, it's as though you already have read our book. I'm deeply impressed. We should have actually, we should have had you a co-author here. That's exactly, I think, what that's very much the questions we're sitting in.
That's interesting.
And the only thing that I would add is I think some of what is remarkable in the biblical text is the way in which the prophets become the ideal, I would say, anthropomorphic expression of eschatology in the Bible, as we see almost every one of the prophets looking at the state of the world, naming the things that are crumbling and falling apart, imagining that there is going to be horror, trial and travail on the horizon, and yet always having some sort of belief that there will be a remnant where there'll be another growth. And I actually think it is, and this is why it's really astute, I think, that you bring up Jeremiah, because Jeremiah
said, I think that in so many ways, it would have been enough, is in tension with what happens when we lose the abundance that maybe we never expected or anticipated. Yeah. And so it relates to the objective that there were historical facts. Babylonian exile, destruction of the Second Temple, there's a lot of data that shows that those things happen. And the eschaton might have been within the sense of feeling crushed, that an institution that you had literally worshipped at, but you had also done a lot to build and sustain, was no more. That an entire group of priests were exiled, and probably they were replaced in the Second Temple period by a different set of priests. So they never actually made it back. And so it's an eschaton within during very human events beyond. And so one wonders, one of the things that we wondered about openly was about the relationship between the individual emotional state and the communal. And that what might define an eschaton is a large enough percentage of people feeling the same sense of profound grief within, the same sense of brokenness the same sense that for them, their days were over, whether or not they lived on.
Mm-hmm. You're making me think about Ezekiel, which I was thinking about anyway, and specifically about chapter 1 that you guys know far more about than I do. But one of the things that's interesting again about the modern study of that chapter is whether it is whether that account of the chariots and so on in Ezekiel 1, which is in very strange disorder, well, what seems like disorder in the Hebrew, doesn't kind of work grammatically and syntactically and so on. That part of the reason is precisely a sense of devastation quite naturally by a community of people who are, well, Ezekiel's crowd are priests. Ezekiel would be a priest if today, as it were, it's his 30th birthday when he has that vision. He would be a priest, but he and his community are devastated. But there, by the river in Babylon, God appears to them, and yet then it's not absolutely clear that it's good news, because it's a nasty storm that God appears in. So there's a big ambiguity about their position in relation to God, both in terms of, there they are back, as it were, in Ur of the Chaldees, where the ancestors came from. Is that bad news? Is that good news? Is that to go back to a hopeless situation from before they really existed as a people, or is that a sign that God could start with them again? And the ambiguity of that seems to me to be significant for Judaism and for the church in a time like ours.
Yes, John, I want to underscore that, affirm that, and also name how brilliant, in my opinion, it is that the Bible contains such disruptive texts. Because,
of course,
because it's not in Jerusalem. It's not with a sacrifice, as Josh was saying. And not only that, part of the role of the prophet is the prophet stands apart from the people. The prophet stands at the margins of humanity. And this is one of the things that Josh and I are noticing, not just in American Judaism, but in other forms of religion here, is in these moments where we feel as though we are coming to an apocalyptic precipice of change. Often what happens is those standing at the margins are the ones who are actually leading the change, that are finally giving a space of belonging to those that have been abandoned by the staid structures of the past. And so for people like me and Josh, who happen to be in positions of power and get to be in places that are well established and have long legacies, it's a wonderful reminder that in each of these eschatons, at least in the context of Judaism, when we feel the crumbling of these structures and these positions of power, it can feel threatening. And yet it is almost invariably the kind of person like an Ezekiel who's standing, beside a river and then happens to have a direct connection with God and actually is able to perceive God directly in a way that maybe not even almost any of the other prophets were able to have. And I think it's a wonderful point to bring up, John, that when we see the things that inspire panic, fear, and anger, it is often great to look a little bit deeper, and we might just see that the most exciting new leaders are gathering on the riverbanks and having a vision of the divine.
Well, now, we guys are going to be able to carry on having a conversation if you're not careful. Any other hands anybody else wants to raise to ask a question or make a comment? Because if not, I'm going to say something different again. Because another thing that struck me early on in what you were saying is the comparison contrast between the position of the believers in Jesus, the Christians, in around AD 70, and the position of the Jews who did not believe in Jesus, particularly in light of the way in which, as far as we can tell, Mark's gospel was written before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and Matthew and Luke were written after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And they have two different angles on it, which relate rather to your way of talking about the eschaton or a eschaton, or mine of talking about a day of the Lord or the day of the Lord. Because it looks as if, again, I'm probably making all sorts of questions that New Testament scholars would argue about, I don't know. But that when Mark gives you his account of Jesus is talking about the disaster that's going to come, in Mark, the disaster evidently hasn't happened. And it could be the eschaton, the day of the Lord. But when Matthew and Luke write their Gospels, they distinguish between the fall. It looks as if they distinguish between the fall of Jerusalem, which has actually happened, and the actual day of the Lord, the end, which is still going to happen. And I'm interested then, I hadn't quite thought this through before, about that relationship within the New Testament that's parallel to that one that you're talking about. And I don't know whether you've got any comment.
It seems, I mean, first of all, prior to Council of Nicaea, it's very clear that rabbinic Jews and Judeo-Christians were going to the same places and making community in the same locations. And so they were almost certainly having the same conversations before the sibling split. I know that very often Christianity is framed in terms of being like a successor or a child religion. No, these are sibling religions. Rabbinic Judaism burst forth from the destruction of the Second Temple, as did Christianity. And so it makes great sense that they would be having parallel process in their approach to the cataclysm that was both essential for their birth. I would submit to you, as a rabbi who does not know nearly enough about Christianity, Christianity would not have taken root in the way that it did without the destruction of the Second Temple. And rabbinic Judaism probably never would have taken root at all. And so both of our traditions are contingent on an eschaton to even exist. And so there's this complicated relationship that you never wish cataclysm on yourself, your society, your people. You never wish vast suffering. And yet, would I really be here building this tradition in absence of it? And so you probably can feel different words, but in a similar notion in both traditions, the tension between living through a time of such destruction and starting to see the glimmers that what came after would be still brighter than anything that existed in the temple itself. The best was yet to come, and maybe confusingly, in the terms of a far more recent scholar, the decline was essential for the sake of the rise. And that the eschaton had to happen for the redemption to happen of the sort that both witnessed.
Yeah, right.
I see Sandy's hand up again, by the way, but
okay, yes,
frankly,
you.
If you shared some sherry, I think we could stick around a lot longer than the conclusion of this session, because this has been a friend. This has been wonderful. But Sandy, please chime in.
Rabbi Stanton, I can't let this go. You teased us all a little bit, for those of us.
I'm going to say we're failing in the wrong direction if we view ourselves as having a demographic crisis. 30 years ago, when the first National Jewish Population Survey came out, there were 5.5 million self-identified Jews in the United States. 30 years since this time of crisis, there are 7.5 million self-identified Jews in the United States. So we are failing in the most marvelous of directions for a community that is worried about its own dissolution. I'm going to let my colleague Ben Spratt say more, but we have a theory that institutional failure and failure of belief are often conflated, and that is to our detriment when living and leading through a time of change. So Ben, I'd love to hear your reflections.
Just kind of building on Josh here is I think what's fascinating in the context of American Judaism, and I would guess that it's very similar with American Catholicism and Protestantism, is we love to tell the story of destruction. We love apocalypse. It sells great movies, it sells great books. And what's almost invariable is that there's an entwined narrative with that. And so, you know, we look back 30 years and people, as Josh said, were framing interfaith marriage, for example, okay, Jews marrying people outside the faith, as being the rise of a second Holocaust, that we were going to see the obliteration of American Judaism because of the admixture of faiths. I will let you know that both Josh and I find ourselves with being mudbloods and having additional faith traditions woven into our faith history here. So certainly we've got a little bit of a bias here, but what's remarkable is not only are American Jews growing at a faster pace than the American population overall. So we have a higher percentage of the American population than we did 30 years ago. but also there's now 1.5 million Jewishly adjacent people who are not Jewish, but are proudly saying that they are connected and tied to Judaism in some way, shape, or form, which is mind-boggling when we look back over the course of Jewish history. In addition to that, you look back a century and we get to see that Jews that were barred from most industries in America struggle to be able to have access to higher education in America. We now are in a place where Jews have access to lead any industry, are not barred from any higher education institution. We find Jewish studies departments in almost every major university. And at least in the context of America, we had 4 Jews run for president of the United States in the last presidential election, something that prior generations of Jews could never even comprehend. So for all the organizations that are lifting up the decline and the demise of American Judaism, Josh and I struggle to be able to see that as really the shining story. So that's how I'd respond.
By the way, the thing that I would elevate out of there that is a total chiddush, a total innovation in the best of ways, is the idea that we are drawn to the notion of eschaton. And how many things do we inadvertently misclassify as eschatology or eschaton that might actually deserve further consideration and perhaps reclassification? One could argue our presentation was about eschatology and not about eschatology. And maybe that is the truest thing that could be said about eschatology itself, that it's about many other things that fill us with trepidation, fear of absolute destruction, and grief. And that once we are filled enough with those emotions, it's hard to tell what's an eschatology of a literal sense, an end of days, and what just is an end of our days as we knew them once.
Does that mean when you use the word eschatology, it's like apocalyptic, it's got negative connotations, when in origin that's not true? And ideally speaking, the day of the Lord was a good day, not a bad day. I mean, Amos had to say, it's going to be a bad day, guys, because you're bad guys. But ideally, the day of the Lord is the day of great blessing. And the eschaton is the day of great blessing, still to come.
So perhaps that is very clarifying on multiple levels. Perhaps we are focused on the precursor to the day of the Lord, day of the eschaton. Right. We're so focused on symptoms and signs that it's happening now in our own time that we're forgetting about the day of the Lord itself.
Right, yeah. Well, now, Carolyn, it's almost the time when you have to close this thing off, don't you? Are you in charge at the end?
Yes.
I'm going to hand over to you then.
Thank you, Dr. Goldingay, for stepping in and, saving the day and helping us with that engaging and stimulating conversation. And thank you so much, Rabbi Joshua Stanton and Rabbi Benjamin for that engaging and stimulating commentary in Rabbi Akiva and the self-fulfilling prophecy of redemption. We've gained so much insight into this. I wish we had much more time to engage in this, but we've been truly blessed and learned so much from both of you. And at this time, we'd like to thank all the participants and for joining us. And I would like to also inform you of our next session will be on 20th of June, 2022, time 6 p.m. London time. And the topic would be developments in Catholic teaching on eschatology. And the speaker would be the Most Reverend Kevin McDonald, we are missing today, unfortunately, but we would be hearing him on June 20th. And so we would like all of you to join us for that. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Good night, good afternoon. Thank you so much.